So it is my great delight and pleasure to welcome Peter. Peter Moss has been a supporter, a mentor, a friend for many, many years. He's also a member of the Early Childhood Research Centre Advisory Board. Peter is Professor Emeritus of Early Childhood Provision at the Thomas Coram Research Unit, University College London Institute of Education. His interests, as many of you know, will know, include early childhood education and care, workforce and children's services, relationship between care, gender and employment, the relationship between early childhood and compulsory education, social pedagogy, democracy and children's services. Many of his work over the last, is it 25 years? Must be more, Peter, has been cross-national, particularly in Europe, it says here, but I don't think we can limit this to Europe. Peter's co-founder of the International Network on Leave Policies and Research, and co-edits the network's annual reviews of leave policies. He is a prolific writer, including some of his recent books, Transformative Change and Real Utopias in Early Childhood Education, a book about Loris Malaguzzi and the schools of Reggio Emilia, which he co-edited with a working group from Reggio Emilia, Alternative Narratives in Early Childhood, an introduction for students and practitioners, Parental Leave and Beyond, which he co-edited with Anne-Sophie Duvandre and Margaret O'Brien, and of course, Transforming Early Childhood in England, which we are going to hear more about now. You're most welcome, Peter. Thank you for being with us this morning.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Matthias, and also it's a pleasure to be with so many of you this morning. Thank you for joining in, and my thanks to DCU for the invitation. I want to talk this morning about a new book, and I want to ask, is its message relevant to Ireland today? New slide, please. Thank you. Oops. The purpose of the book, in very broad terms, is to provoke critical reflection and to stimulate widespread debate, and above all, to arouse hope that something better is both necessary and possible. And that seems very important just now with the coronavirus and everything that's going on alongside it. And I think that need for hope and the possibility for hope is captured by Arundhati Roy, the Indian writer, when she says, historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. So I suppose our book is an attempt to imagine one part of that world anew, that part that is early childhood education. Next slide, please. Our starting point has been the experience in England over the last 25 years, because after decades of neglect, early childhood education and care became a policy priority almost overnight in 1997 when New Labour came to power. But at the same time, by that stage, early childhood had accumulated deep-seated problems. And it's our contention that successive English governments failed to tackle those inherited problems. We write, they preferred to put sticking plasters on a deeply flawed system rather than conduct a thorough diagnosis and an effective course of treatment. Indeed, in some respects, government actions since 1997, as it has become a policy priority, has made matters worse rather than better. If you like, we were in a hole in 1997 and we rather dug that hole deeper. Next slide, please. Okay, so I was saying that in fact, what we've had in England is a sudden switch to policy priority for early childhood, but a failure to actually fix the problems that have been inherited from years of policy neglect. and in many respects, policy initiatives have made things worse rather than better. So our overall assessment is that the system of early childhood education and care in England does not work for children or parents, workers or society. Nothing short, oh sorry, could you go back to that? Thank you. Nothing short of transformation is now needed to give young children the all-round upbringing they have a right to, and parents the support they need to both work and care. And the term transformation is very key here. By that, we're talking about fundamental change of structures and practices, but perhaps most important of all, fundamental change in thinking, how we think about early childhood. Next slide, please. Now, although the title of the book and the subject of the book is very much focused on England, I think it's very relevant, certainly to other English-speaking countries, including Ireland. And I say that because English-speaking countries have rather striking similarities if you look at the welfare state in general, and if you look at early childhood in particular. For example, if you look at the welfare state, English-speaking countries tend to have rather ungenerous welfare benefits. You can see that, for example, in the very poor parental leave systems that we have in countries not only like England and Ireland, but obviously beyond that in Australia, United States, and so forth. These countries also tend to place a great emphasis on personal responsibility, with the welfare state being more of a safety net than a universal provision. These English-speaking countries tend to favour very strongly the marketisation and privatisation of services rather than public provision. And when we look at early childhood education and care policies and practices, once again, we see a lot of similarities. Next slide, please. For example, typically we see a split system of early childhood, split between childcare and education, with fragmented and divisive services, preschool, play schools, nurseries, school-based services, and so forth, and a persistent focus on childcare instead of education. We see in all these countries too a split and devalued workforce, overwhelmingly female. That of course applies everywhere in the world. But what is more particularly true of the English-speaking world is that the workforce is mostly childcare workers rather than teachers, and with a low status, low levels of qualification, and scandalously low levels of payment. We tend to see in the English language world a reliance on childcare markets dominated by private for-profit services. Certainly in England and in some other English-speaking countries, we see an early entry to primary school, an age I would contend is far too young. In England, it's the age of 4. And what this does is effectively weaken the early childhood sector, because children leave it in large numbers from the age of 3 or 4. Next slide, please. We see in England, and I think in some other English-speaking countries, a standardized one-size-fits-all curriculum focused on preparing children for primary school at the expense of diversity and context, a culture too of targets, measurement, and numbers, and weak parenting leaves, very weak maternity and parental leave, and a lack of synergy with early childhood services. Typically, in the English-speaking world, you see a large gap between the end of well-paid leave and the beginning of an entitlement to early childhood education and care, a gap where there is no entitlement to any form of provision. And finally, a democratic deficit is widespread. Democracy is absent as a stated value, as a daily practice, and as a means of governing early childhood services. Next slide, please. Now, moving on from our critique, the problems we see in England and we think beyond England, to more hopeful discussions about what we could have, how we could transform. services. We base our arguments on research. We base them on innovative policy and practice in a range of countries. And we base them on the rights of young children as contained in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, and on General Comment number 7, which is about early childhood, from the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child. This comment was published in 2005. And the comment says, amongst other things, that early childhood services should be coordinated and multi-sectoral. It says work with young children should be socially valued and properly paid in order to attract a highly qualified workforce, men as well as women. And perhaps most important of all, it emphasizes the right of the child to education that begins, I quote, at birth and is closely linked to young children's right to maximum development. So we build our transformatory proposals on these foundations. Next slide, please. The core of our proposal is the need to transform early childhood so that we have a public and fully integrated system of early childhood education. That is an early childhood education that is recognized as a public good and as an essential part of the welfare state and social infrastructure. It is a public system provided by public bodies, in England, for example, local authorities, and also by not-for-profit private providers. And finally, it is a system based on cooperation in networks rather than competition between businesses. Also central to our proposal is that early childhood education from 0 to 6 is recognized as the first stage of the education system, with primary school starting at the age of 6, and a strong and equal partnership between this first stage of education and subsequent stages, primary, secondary, and higher. And finally, fundamental to our proposal is that this system should be based on the fundamental values of democracy, cooperation, and solidarity. Next slide, please. Within that broad basis, we set out a number of more specific proposals. We want a system based on integrated access. That means an entitlement to early childhood services for all children from birth to 6 years, and also an entitlement to access for their carers, as well as combining that with 12 months of well-paid maternity and parental leave. So that's integrated access. The second strand is integrated provision. We propose that provision should be in multi-purpose and community-based children's centres. I think a very important innovation that first emerged in England in the 1970s, but actually multiplied when government supported it in England during the 2000s. The third strand is an integrated workforce based on a graduate early childhood worker. The graduate worker might be a teacher, an early years teacher, or an early years social pedagogue. And we think that that early years teacher or pedagogue should make up at least 60% of the workforce. And above all, they should have parity in pay, in qualification, and in status with school teachers. The fourth strand is integrated funding. One system of funding from 0 to 6 based on direct funding of services, no more subsidies paid to parents, with free attendance for a core period, which might be the length of a normal school day. We also, and I haven't put it on here, but we think it's important that there should be integrated responsibility for early childhood services, and that integrated responsibility should be in education. And the final strand is the idea of an integrative concept which spans 0 to 6, and which would be a broad concept of education, education in its broadest sense, along with an ethics of care. And I'll come on to that in a moment. Next slide, please. So we are arguing for a system that is first and foremost educational. We want early childhood education services, not childcare services. We want early childhood teachers or social pedagogues, not childcare workers. But, and I want to emphasize strongly, we do not ignore the needs of employed parents. Those needs are recognised in general hours in our integrated provision and a strong parental leave system. And also, we do not drop care. Rather, we argue that all children, and indeed all adults, whether they are employed or not, require care. But care understood as an ethic about how children and adults should relate to each other. So what we are arguing for is a system for young children of early childhood education inscribed with an ethic of care. Next slide, please. But as well as these structural strands, these structural principles, we also want a system with strong pedagogical principles, principles that include an image of the rich child, a child recognized as having great potential and born with 100 languages. We argue for a system based on slow knowledge, slow thinking and slow pedagogy, which gives people time to go deeply into meaning and knowledge and to reflect and to think and to dialogue and to project. We want a system based on observation and documentation where all learning in its full diversity and complexity becomes visible and valued. And we want an assessment that is a cooperative and dynamic process embedded in everyday experience. If you like, a form of democratic accountability. Think pedagogical documentation or learning stories. And finally, pedagogical principles that trust in and respect the agency, capabilities and potentialities of children, practitioners and parents. Next slide, please. We also talk about the need for a transformation process to get to a transformed early childhood service. That process, we think, includes a transition period, probably because we've all left it far too late, now running up to 15 years. And during that 15 years, there must be continuity of policy, no more chopping and changing. We also think that all streams of early childhood funding should be brought together into one single early childhood fund, which is used to directly fund services. As I say, no more subsidies paid to parents. And a final strand in the transformation process is a competent system of support for services and their workforces. I think if we're going to have transformation, the need for that system of support is paramount. So I think we can say our proposed transformation is utopian, but I think we could also say that it is a real utopia, which is not only desirable, but we think viable and achievable. And indeed, the examples we give from elsewhere make that very apparent. Next slide, please. So that's my 20 minutes, and this is my final slide. That's where you can reach me if you want to discuss what I've talked about after this webinar. Very happy to exchange with you the details of the book, and you'll see there also how you can access the book for free by going to the University College London Press site and using that web link, and there you'll find that you can simply click and get onto the book straight away. So it's been very good to speak to you, and I look forward to discussing further with you during the next part of this session. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. And what a start, and how is this relevant to the situation we have been facing in this country for many years? I'm going to try now to make that connection, and so we can actually lead into a discussion about how that transformation to a universal public rights-based early childhood education care system could be initiated and can be initiated on this side of the Irish Sea. Okay, just before I go into this, just a brief, as a matter of introduction, just to say briefly that this presentation and the analysis and arguments in it are based on my own work, obviously, but also on a number of proposals developed by a group called Inform, which has come together to inform the process of transforming the early child education and care system here in this country. We're an independent group of experts and senior professionals and academics. We're offering critical and constructive thinking to this process. We don't have a mandate, we don't speak for any particular interest group, but we are offering thought and contributions, and some of the arguments in this presentation now have been written up in more detail in a number of papers in preparation for the program for government. So if you want to know more about Inform, please contact us at these two emails, at my own email or informec@gmail.com, and download the papers at this rather awkward link, but I'm able to share that over the email if it's easier for you to click. Next slide, please. It's not like nothing has happened in Ireland. I quite like the title of a paper published by Wolfe and O'Donoghue, Hines, and Norrin Hayes in 2013 that says this, that talks about rapid change without transformation as the key characteristic of the Irish early childhood system. So despite rapid change, development of the present Irish early childhood system has been characterized by general lack of strategic forward planning, a lack of a shared vision, starting from the rights and the needs and the experience of children. What we have today is the result of 30 to 40 years of committed but very patchy endeavors to provide early childhood education and care. It is the result of incremental changes arising from generally reactive policy decisions. It is based on a public policy discourse that places childcare needs of working parents over children's rights to education and care from birth. And it's a system valued, it's a value system rooted in the belief that individual private providers, including voluntary and community-based, and businesses, that is the market, can and should provide what is fundamentally a common good and a public responsibility. Next slide, please. And many internal and external observers have pointed out for years that there are some persistent systemic challenges arising from this approach to providing a public service. It is about the general governance, including regulation and evaluation of such a system. It is the persistent underfunding and the resourcing of the overall system and its supports, the competent support system Peter mentioned. It is about a persistent fragmentation of services and support structures. It's about marketization and over-reliance on private enterprise for provision of a public service. And as we've seen more recently, during 2020, it is a lack of system resilience in times of disruption. The system is simply not able to cope with major disruptions. Next slide, please. But this is not sort of a COVID crisis alone. Thinking back to 2019, 2020, early 2020, we've seen a rapid succession of crises for early child education and care in Ireland, reflecting these systemic challenges. The scandal of child maltreatment and professional malpractice, which was exacerbated by insufficient response by the inspectorate. It had to be revealed once again last year by investigative journalism. We've seen an existential threat to early childhood services caused by an unsustainable insurance model and the absence of state-supported indemnity. we've seen the breakdown of an unsustainable tension that pitches affordability for parents against quality for children and decent working conditions for early childhood education educators. And we've seen the continued scandal of precarious employment for the majority of early childhood educators, leading to unsustainable staff turnover rates and endangering the well-being of children. And then, of course, we've seen the collapse of the business model for many services due to the pandemic. Next slide, please. In June this year, June 2020, the coalition of three parties, the Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and the Greens, published a program for government. And early childhood, which is very welcome, occupies a prominent place in the program, although it's mostly in relation to childcare and its affordability for parents. So when we look at this program, we find the term childcare features 31 times in the program. Early education is mentioned only twice. And here are the two mentions. The first time early education appears in this program is when it says, for providers, we recognize the value of early education and childcare for children, and we will introduce a long-term sustainable funding model that promotes quality, better outcomes for children, and makes a career in childcare more attractive. And the second and last time early education is mentioned is when it says, we will fully implement the access and inclusion model that helps children with additional needs to access early education and care settings. So that doesn't seem to be very clearly, it's not a program that prioritizes children's universal right to early child education from birth. Next slide. We have in this program a list of 12 bullet points under the heading Early Years Education and Affordable Childcare. And you have to work your way through item 3 out of 12 to read that there is a commitment to reform the childcare system, to create one that brings together the best of community and childcare provision, is focused on children's rights and quality outcomes, reduces inequalities, supports staff retention, and substantially reduces costs to parents. Such a commitment to reform is welcome. The terminology, however, I think is very concerning. Well, across Europe and more widely internationally, countries and international organizations recognize the importance of an integrated early child education and care system, with education as a universal right of young children and the value of its own. The government seems to be embarking on a largely utilitarian route. Framing the purpose of the early childhood system largely as child care, Ireland seems to be disassociating herself from the global consensus. And moreover, prioritizing childcare over education risks again deepening the existing conceptual split between the two and exacerbate its damaging effect on the Irish early childhood system. Next slide, please. So all in all, what we see in the program for government is a list of 12 specific commitments covering a rather wide range of issues, from the establishment of a single government agency to be called Childcare Ireland, tasked with developing and assuring quality, over further investment to reduce costs for parents through universal and targeted subsidies, measures to improve terms and conditions of employment, to piloting an apprenticeship scheme. You could read this as an aspirational program that is linked to what is goal D in our 10-year strategy, first 5, a whole of government strategy for babies, young children and their families. But it's clearly not a program for initiating change. It's not a commitment to a universal rights-based public early childhood education and care system. Next slide, please. Trolling through the internet, you've come across all sorts of interesting tropes, and here's one from John F. Kennedy that he supposedly said in 1959. It's about the crisis representing danger and opportunity. I really think this crisis provides us with an opportunity to stop, to take stock, to re-evaluate and redesign how we provide early childhood education and care in this country. There are a number of obvious structural elements that need to be looked at in terms of moving towards what we call a competent system. There are some existing ones that will have to be looked at. Some will have to be scrapped. New ones will have to be put in place. All of them have been emphasized by experts and participants in the system for many years. They include public policy and resourcing under the auspices of one government department, which directly draws on the expertise of professionals involved across all early childhood education care setting types. It involves support structures at local level to lead and enable joint planning, accessible professional development, and opportunities for sharing learning. It is a provision to be based on the needs of local communities, defined through participatory short, medium, and long-term planning, not through business plans. It involves an active, cohesive monitoring, evaluation, and research system that is about setting standards and about documenting and investigating perspectives of all stakeholders, including children, families, educators, and that replaces the current very differentiated inspection regimes. And most urgently, I would argue, it involves the establishment of an autonomous, inclusive professional body for early childhood education and care that represents the collective identity of that profession, responsible for professional conduct and ethics, overseeing things like continuous professional development, qualifications, and others. Next slide, please. But as Peter so strongly argues, system change is not merely a structural task. To suggest so would reduce a technical and managerial task. It would reduce it to a technical and managerial task, but it is fundamentally a political, ethical, and democratic project. So before we can address structural questions about service provision and governance in a meaningful way, we have to engage with more far-reaching questions. And that question is, what do we as a society entering the third decade of the 21st century aspire to for all children? It's a question of values, ethical stances, and most of all of vision. And one of the central points of critique of the Irish early childhood system has been the absence of a shared vision amidst the multitude of fragmented views, vested interests, and a cacophony of voices within and around early childhood education and care. But we can change the way we think about early childhood. Our heads around so that thoughts can change direction. Next slide, please. Really, just to conclude this, I think the policy choices that we make today are really important because they will determine the reality of cohorts of young children and their families and their educators for years, if not decades to come. But in terms of moving towards achievable, desirable, achievable, and viable utopias, Ireland has shown remarkable capacity and capability for social transformation in recent years. Changes unimaginable not too long ago have happened. Just to sort of mention things like women's reproductive rights, marriage equality, equality legislation, and dare I say, cycle path. These changes were achieved through broad and informed democratic debate, civic and political leadership, and it's about time that we applied these capabilities to the education and care of the youngest children. And it's very strange times, actually, when you find yourself agreeing with a papal encyclical. But I couldn't agree more on this one, just issued by Pope Francis, where it says, anyone who thinks that the only lesson to be learned was the need to improve what we were already doing or refine existing systems and regulations is denying reality. So thank you all for attending this morning. This is the discussion to be continued with all of you. Thank you very much.